Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Do you know why my voice has gone funny? I'm deciding whether or not to be a little economical with the actuality with you, but I can't. I have to tell you the truth. I've only seen highlights. I've only seen clips of the debate last night because I was watching the tennis highlights on the other side. I'm Team Marina. Are you aware that Andy Murray and Serena Williams' mixed doubles partnership has been dubbed Marina? And I don't know why, but it just made the world seem temporarily a happier place to see them cutting it up in SW19. But I will take your advice on what happened. Here is an astonishing state of affairs. And I used to do this quite often. Like, imagine you've just woken up after being put in a coma. Or imagine that you've been on a space station that somehow wasn't receiving news from Earth. It's nearly the middle of July 2019, so in a way we need to go back to the middle of May 2016, don't we, or the middle of June 2016. And if you had gone exploring the Amazon rainforest, if you were seeking out a lost tribe of pygmies in the middle of the jungle, and you had been incommunicado for the best part of 4 years, how on earth would you return to the political landscape of 21st century Britain and of course Europe and America and make sense of it? It is sometimes, when you do it every day, you lose the perspective that you achieve by taking several steps back from the fray. God, that almost rhymes. Are you writing this down, Keith? You look at the state of play, and because it's, do you know, I'm going to use an odd analogy now, but it's one that everyone will recognise. It's a bit like when Grandma comes to visit and she comments on how much everyone's grown. And because you've seen them every day over the 3 or 4 month period during which Grandma hasn't seen them, you haven't noticed the fact that they've grown. And you might have little marks on the kitchen door frame or something like that, but generally, my goodness me, they've grown. You go, no, they haven't, Mum. They're the same size that they were yesterday. I think I'm a bit like that now with politics. It's because you're watching it every day. It's so hard to escape from. You sort of forget perspective. So I could perhaps be misrepresenting NHS professionals with what I'm about to say, but Jeremy Hunt presided over an astonishing collapse in morale and patient satisfaction. So a huge diminishment of staff happiness and patient satisfaction while he was Secretary of State for Health. He insulted and maligned junior doctors. He also misrepresented them. But he did so with a sort of smoothness, I suppose you would have to call it, that belied the evidence and belied the truth. And modern Britain being modern Britain, 70 to 80% of print media facilitated his smooth denial of reality. So he then moved up the ladder of politics. I think, is that fair, do you think, to say? I mean, would you like to give me a ring and defend Jeremy Hunt's record at the NHS? Did he pull off some epic coup that I'm currently unaware of? Doctors and nurses are only allowed on this, or possibly patients. So, last night, the two men who are vying to be our next Prime Minister, one of whom presided over an astonishing diminishment of status, happiness and satisfaction in the National Health Service, and the other of whom presided over astonishing mismanagement and misspending in London before lending his weight to a campaign to cripple Britain, a weight without which that campaign would never have succeeded. Jeremy Hunt, for it is he, and Boris Johnson, for it is he, are now vying to be our next Prime Minister. And because I was watching the tennis, just sort of getting myself in the mood for Love Island, I didn't really focus upon the debate. It's minutiae. I found it really helpful to sort of watch it through binoculars rather than having a ringside seat that would be my ordinary position. And it is one of those mornings where I just find myself wondering, how has it come to this? Now, I appreciate that's not your typical phone-in question for a Wednesday morning. I should be asking you to ring in and tell me why you're cross with a woman for example, or why we should absolutely respect Donald Trump insulting our Prime Minister and our ambassador because that's all about taking back control, or something like that. But I don't want to today. As you know, I always credit you with a bit more intelligence than that. How has it come to this? So there's two questions at the heart of this inquiry. The first is, have I just completely misrepresented reality? Boris Johnson is talking twaddle now, and he's talking twaddle ceaselessly, because from what I saw and from what I've heard, the attempts by Jeremy Hunt to impose a little bit of reality on proceedings, and the attempts by Julie Etchingham, the ITV presenter, to impose a little bit of reality on proceedings, Boris Johnson just sort of bloviated his way through. Some of the clips make for very ugly listening. They're the televisual equivalent of Prime Minister's questions. It's just a rabble, you know. And that, I think, was Johnson's tactic. Again, you tell me, 0345 6060 973. A few of you pointing out it's only NHS England that Jeremy Hunt did those things to. The situation in Scotland, of course, remains, some say, very, very different. So Boris Johnson has sort of reached the point where some of us knew he would always end up, where he is just going blah, 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 and not saying anything substantive at all, because the minute he says anything substantive, it falls apart. You heard on this programme yesterday that the Director General of the World Trade Organization has poured liquid manure over all of the claims by Boris Johnson and similar, ERG-style Brexiters. Rees-Mogg said we'd be able to carry on as we are for 10 years. In any other line of work, he'd be suspended, right? He'd be struck off. We'd be able to carry on as we are under WTO terms for 10 years, says Jacob Rees-Mogg. No, you won't, says the Director General of the World Trade Organization. Imagine if Rees-Mogg was a driving instructor. Yeah, you can absolutely go up that one-way street. That's absolutely fine. You could go up for 10 years. We're allowed to carry on as we are under Article 24 of GATT, which he neither understands nor properly represents. But I digress, because Johnson is the one in the spotlight. And every single thing he has said recently has been proved wrong by events. It's been proved wrong by reality. And, do you know, even if you want to point to these desperately welcome nuggets of good news, whether it was Jaguar Land Rover last week or whether it's the electric Mini that BMW will hopefully be building next year in this country, these are nuggets of good news in an otherwise unstoppable flow of bad news. Things are supposed to get better. Digby Jones, who we don't hear from much these days, swore blind that BMW bosses would march in to see Angela Merkel and demand that the European Union kowtowed to our every demand. As I say, BMW is moving its engine production, it was announced yesterday, to Germany. So Johnson is just blowing bubbles now, right? He is just blowing bubbles. Hunt, in many ways, is even stranger. Because logically, I can make sense of Boris Johnson's position. It's what Boris Johnson's position has always been. Utterly hollow, allegedly charismatic bloviations. And it works. That's the point. When other Conservatives say he's electable, he wins, he's popular, that's what they're referring to. His utterly hollow, fact-free, vaguely inspirational. He's a little bit like one of those calendars with a quote on it every day, isn't he? We need to get off the hamster wheel of doom. You don't have to be mad to work here, but it helps. That's Boris Johnson, really. He is a sort of inspirational calendar quote made flesh. And people mistake that for some sort of Churchillian gravitas. Truly, we have been brought lower than I can almost conceive of. So Johnson does his inspirational quotes and his utterly fact-free bloviations. And then Hunt sort of says it's going to be absolutely awful. People are going to lose their jobs. And I will preside over that with a heavy heart, because that's what people want. And you sort of, again, this question of perspective, just stepping back from the to and fro of the quotidian, and instead focusing upon the meta, the big picture. How the hell has this happened? How have we got one man claiming that his record at the NHS, which got worse under every available measure while he was in charge of it, qualifies him for the biggest job in politics, going toe-to-toe with another man whose almost every utterance now has been rendered ridiculous. And the Conservative Party membership are going to pick the ridiculous one rather than the slightly less ridiculous one? 30 minutes after 10, here is the question, and I want you to pile in on the phones on this one, because you can come at it from an angle of feeling nothing but joy at the prospect of a Boris Johnson premiership, or nothing but misery, or even ambivalence. Imagine I have been asleep since the beginning of 2016, right? So David Cameron was Prime Minister, austerity was still underway, Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, so that stayed. Just imagine I've been asleep for 3.5 years, and I've woken up to find the man who wasted millions and millions and millions of pounds as Mayor of London, who has imperilled the life of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe in a filthy Iranian jail, and a politician whose every utterance has been shown to be dishonest and or deceitful, is vying against the Secretary of State for Health, who presided over a decline in almost every single section of the health service, to be our next Prime Minister. How has that happened? 0345 6060 973. And before you ask, no, I can't. Not with Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the opposition. I can't. I can't come up with a better alternative. So I'm not asking you to today. I'm just asking you to explain how we've ended up here. Here are the numbers now. You will get through. 0345 6060 973. Can you explain something I don't understand, says an unsigned text. We can sign up under Article 24 of GATT if both sides agree. How can that not happen? That is called a deal, okay? It's called a deal. People saying no deal allows us to do Article 24 of GATT are talking through their hat. I can't be responsible for the fact that you see 2 and a plus sign and 2 and don't end up with 4. I can be responsible for the fact that you see Hunt versus Johnson and have a better grasp than I do at the moment of how on earth the country has been offered a choice between... How would you describe it? It's like walking into a restaurant and being offered even a rat burger or a hare sandwich. What happened to our menu? And I will add a little side order to today's meat and 2 veg, and that is genuine question. Any businesses moving here because of Brexit? Any businesses that you're aware of that are greeting the possibility of a no-deal Brexit as an opportunity, and they will move here and do things here that they don't currently do? 0345 6060 973. Seem to lose sight sometimes of the very simple fact that companies announcing that they're going to carry on doing some of the stuff they currently do, that's not a justification for setting fire to the rest of the building. And speaking of setting fire to the rest of the building, imagine, if you would, that I'd been on Mars since January 2016, unable to communicate with home, unable even to hear from Earth. And this morning I landed. And I've just been watching the highlights of last night's debate, and I'm absolutely flabbergasted to discover that our next Prime Minister will be either the man who's presided over absolute diminishment of the NHS in every available department, and a man who has become a byword for bloviation, incompetence and dishonesty. Just seriously, even if you like them and you resent my description of them thus, how has it come to this? John's in Edinburgh. John, what do you think?
I think probably the reason is that I think that Britain has been rinsed over the last while, because we're only listening to people like Boris, like Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Johnson.
And then when we're told...
Johnson.
Sorry?
Johnson, not
Johnson,
Boris.
my apologies.
Carry on.
And the only alternative put to us is Corbyn, and he's ridiculed.
Mm.
Now,
we're not having this debate yet, but he deserves to be ridiculed. but Rees-Mogg and Johnson aren't generally ridiculed. That, I think, is the point that you're making.
Indeed. But I think the point I'm trying to make is, in Scotland, you refer to the NHS, and it is different up here.
Yes.
Okay? We have an alternative up here to that mayhem that is south of the border. And people have been listening, whether one agrees or disagrees with the SNP, they're getting the votes. Because people know that they've been offered another way, not necessarily a better way, another way. And they've listened. Now, I'm not aware of any national station, including LBC, that has, for the sake of arguments, put Nicola Sturgeon down and said, you got it better a different way in Scotland. Why are you leaving? What are we doing wrong here? I'm sure she could.
That's a very good point. I think Ian Dale's had Nicola Sturgeon on a couple of times. I could be wrong, but we should try and get her on. Can we put that down? And I think you may be slightly misrepresenting LBC, but then of course you steer us back to the observation that by treating people like Rees-Mogg seriously, you actually end up conning the entire nation.
Well, we're conned into believing that the only alternative is Jeremy Corbyn, who we then ridicule.
We can't vote with the SNP in London.
No, but you can understand that in other parts of the UK, that things are different and things can be better. Now, if people hear this and refuse to go to politicians and say, can we not have some of that?
Yeah,
if
I hear you. You're steering us.
You're
steering us slightly away from the central course of this question, but you. I think if I'm going to paraphrase what you said, how have we ended up with such a clown show of a choice for our next Prime Minister? The answer is that the massive majority of the media doesn't point out their clownishness. No, whether it's the junior doctors' strike, where most of the media presented Jeremy Hunt as somehow having succeeded, or whether it is Boris Johnson, who is still, he's got an entire national newspaper dedicated to doing his PR at the moment, the Daily Telegraph. Broadcast media, whether it's impartial like the BBC or whether it's not impartial, broadcast media is I think, invisibly influenced by these things. So even if it's me coming on air every morning having checked out what the enemy is thinking, then for other people who do what I do for a living, that they are swallowing wholesale the nonsense that the Telegraph prints about Johnson or that Rees-Mogg spouts about Gatt. And if people in this line of work are swallowing it wholesale, how can you get cross with punters for swallowing it wholesale? Up to the point where these two people stand and face each other across a television studio, and everyone could see Boris Johnson last night from what I saw, just riding roughshod over any questions, refusing to answer, throwing the British ambassador, Her Majesty's ambassador to Washington under a bus, essentially taking the knee in front of Donald Trump, a man who he has previously described as stupefyingly ignorant. Objective truth has disappeared, and I guess that has to be our fault.
I think succinctly you put it correct. I think we have things happening in the background, like Liam Fox apparently is going to the US to talk about trade.
Yes, but you know who too?
Important
you know
stuff.
Who he's talking to?
Yeah, he's talking to Ivanka Trump.
Yes, that well-known third-rate jewellery designer.
Yeah, who Boris Johnson, in actual fact, is the British version of in ways.
Well, there we are. I do want people who quite like the choice between Johnson and Hunt, or people who are enthused by the choice of Boris Johnson. I had a quick look around Twitter to see what the usual cheerleaders were saying, and it was pretty dismal. One of them just said, he's got such a lovely turn of phrase. Get off the hamster wheel. Imagine watching an entire debate with the man that is going to be our next Prime Minister, searching for something positive to say, and coming up with, I quite like hamster wheel of doom as a phrase. It's almost like Homer Simpson has taken over politics. From John to John. Can we try and do just Johns in the first hour? No, I've got to stop being so childish. The country's burning. John's in Ampleforth. That rings a bell. John, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. I don't have a solution to the quandary in which we find ourselves, but I'm just ringing up with a thought about optimism for leadership, because I think the benchmark is already out there, and I always would default to someone like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand as a leader of great integrity with a common touch, who enjoys the respect of the world, and she's done that by an alternative route, and that is a route of not self-serving ambition, but of actual genuine engagement with people who she comes into contact with. And I think back to not so long ago when there was a headline in The Observer, I think it was the last leadership challenge, where the headline was a pitiful parade of leaders. And I think we could do better as a nation if we simply say integrity counts and make that our starting point. I just think we could do better.
Oh, well, I do as well, but who would police integrity? Because one thing that this sort of weird fake news alt-right pincer movement has done is equate minor misdemeanors with massive ones. So you have, for example, during the American presidential campaign, Trump is surrounded by people who end up in jail, and yet his supporters are still convinced that Hillary Clinton did something wrong with her emails, even though they can't explain what it is or what happened. So who's in charge of integrity? Do you see what I mean? Who is the Pope of integrity? integrity.
Well,
It should be the media again.
Well, indeed. But I think in some respects this is self-policing, because if people have a choice, in the end they have an understanding of the kind of person they are going to be voting for. And nobody's perfect, everybody has flaws, but people will have their own tolerances of what they think is reasonable and what isn't. And
but they don't, they don't, John, because they don't. I've taken calls, and some, most aren't as honest as he was, but there's a caller I took a few weeks ago who's really stuck in my mind, where he said, yeah, I know Trump lies. I know he's this, I know he's that, but he annoys people like you, and that's why I like him. I think the same probably applies to Boris Johnson. I don't even know what people like you means, unless it means people who care about integrity and honesty.
Yeah, well, I said when I started I don't have a solution. I was just offering a thought. And, the world is what the world is.
Yes.
And we have moved in a direction, personally, which I think a lot of reasonable people do find unpalatable, but we are where we are.
Right, well, I'd love to speak to people who don't find it unpalatable, people who are absolutely delighted about what's going on for reasons that involve their own advancement rather than other people's unhappiness. It seems to me astonishing to build a political project on the fact that making people poor and unemployed is going to really hack some other people off, and that's great.
Yeah,
the other problem with Jacinda Ardern, about whom I know little, is that, I don't know if you've picked up on this, but there's an awful lot of men in my business who turn into simpering sycophants when they're confronted with powerful men, however corrupt they are. You look at a Trump, or in the context of moral corruption, you look at a Johnson. These men who still dominate British media seem to have a real problem with powerful people who aren't either white or male or both. You think of, off the top of your head, you just sort of look at Michelle Obama, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or even Meghan Markle. Powerful women of colour really annoy them, and they dominate my industry, so I don't know that we'd ever get a Jacinda Ardern up and running in the UK.
I agree with you. I think our system is not conducive to producing such people. I can't remember who it was who said not so long ago that we create organisations or schools like Eton to train leaders, and then we're surprised when they come into power. I mean, that is just the way the English system has worked. And
it is, although I can't let you malign Eton without mentioning that you're just down the road from my own alma mater at the moment, which is a crucible of similar privilege.
Yes, but I was quoting someone, not making that up as a personal.
Do you have links to the school, John? While you're on?
Yeah, I do, but
we'll leave it there. Can you find out if I'm still banned from the premises? I'd love to take my girls up to visit.
No, give me a call sometime. We'll give you a tour.
Thank you, John. It's coming up to 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question is a simple one. How has it come to this? It's also, as with all the best simple questions, quite incredibly complicated. You can query my descriptions if you want. You're more than welcome to. You can tell me what Boris Johnson said last night that gives grounds for the optimism that his supporters, or that he tells us we need, or believe in Brexit has turned into we need to be optimistic. Well, we've had 3 years for you to give us grounds for optimism. All the things you've told us to be optimistic about have fallen apart. This isn't an opinion. This is a matter of record. This is a matter of fact. You said that the German car industry would not countenance us pulling ourselves from the free market, from the single market. You said that they needed us more than we needed them. You said that, well, you said a million things. None of them have come true. So I could have been optimistic if any of the stuff you said had come true, but none of it has, unless I'm forgetting something, in which case, 0345 606 0973. This is nice from Trollope. My thanks to I'm Incorrigible for steering me towards a reassuring literary moment from the past. A certain class of dishonesty magnificent in its proportions and climbing into high places, has become so rampant and so splendid that there seems to be reason for fearing that men and women will be taught to feel that dishonesty, if it can become splendid, will cease to be abominable. So I would describe Boris Johnson thus. He is dishonesty that has become splendid and therefore has ceased to be abominable. That, I think, is the mechanism which allows people who I think genuinely do care most of the time about things like honesty, integrity, fidelity, all of the above, to turn off their moral compasses, because that dishonesty has become splendid. He's so splendidly dishonest. He's so unapologetically dishonest, moving from political position to political position with the fluidity and ease and absence of conscience that he employs when moving from wife to mistress to wife. I get that. I also think a certain sort of cowed psychology envies that sort of sexual incontinence. You think Johnson must be happy because he's like a cat on heat. I personally don't think he is. For me, I could be wrong, but for me, happiness comes from a partnership of equals, a partnership built upon commitment, shared values, love and trust. But I'm a bit old-fashioned British and Christian like that. So on the one hand, you've got this splendid dishonesty, and on the other hand, with Hunt, I think you've got, and this is me now, not Trollope, so it won't sound quite as lyrical, I think you've got a dismal honesty. So when he says, there's a lot of anger in Kidderminster, obviously, about this plant that he keeps referring to for two reasons. Number one, they don't want to lose their jobs, and I saw an exchange on Facebook between a woman whose husband works there and had previously been posting the sort of stuff on her Facebook page about the European Union and of course Muslims that we're all too familiar with, and a couple of people were pointing out, you did actually vote for this. If your husband loses his job, it will be your fault. You just begin to see the pendulum swinging when the wolf is actually at the door, not through the door yet, but at the door. And Hunt stands there and says, well, yeah, you're going to lose your jobs, and I will deliver Brexit with a heavy heart. You sort of go, whoa. So he's dismally honest, almost sociopathically honest. No, that's the wrong word. It's surreal. I know that's overused, but he's almost surreally honest. The idea that British politics has reached a point where a contender for the Prime Ministership can stand up and say, yep, you're going to lose your jobs, but that's what you voted for, and that's what I'm going to deliver. This is all just true. None of this is opinion yet. I don't think I've expressed an opinion yet. Everything I've said is demonstrable fact today. Jeremy Hunt is saying, you are going to lose your jobs, but that's what you voted for, and I will deliver it with a heavy heart. Johnson is still saying, optimism, believe, and then when quizzed on detail, he just burbles and bloviates. That's the choice that we're left with. How has it come to this? 0345 606 0973. Grace is in Islington. Grace, what do you think?
Hi, James.
Hello, Grace.
I think your first introduction about what would you do if you woke up after a coma after 4 years.
3.5.
I think it was me, 3.5. I think it was me, my head would just explode.
Yes.
And I
thought things were pretty bad at the beginning of 2016 in the context of austerity. And we hadn't heard about Windrush and various other issues, particularly the NHS and what have you. But now, woo, how the hell did that happen?
It's almost like, you know, we're on a downward trajectory to the bottom of politics, both in the UK and in
You're not
the
sounding
US.
very optimistic.
No, I'm not really. I mean, I do think that the Conservatives and those who want Brexit don't really care what happens to most of people in Britain. They really care about their own interests.
And then you hear them coming out today saying that the working class will be betrayed if we don't leave without it. So at the same time, you've got Jeremy Hunt saying, yeah, you are all going to lose your jobs, but that's what you voted for. And then you've got right-wing commentators saying the working class, whatever they mean by that, will be betrayed if we don't make them lose their jobs. Just every corner is utterly, utterly confounding.
It is absolutely insane. It's almost like, you know, saying to one of your children, if they're quite small, saying, I would prefer if you didn't put your hand on the gas ring, but it's your choice and therefore you can. I mean, it's just...
I will take you to the Burns unit with a heavy heart, but you voted to put your hand in the fire, and I respect your vote.
It is absolutely ludicrous. And
then Boris Johnson is saying it's not a fire; it's just a hologram. And if you just believe in it, it'll turn into a fridge.
But you have said, and it has been proven time and time again, that he is dishonesty personified. He doesn't care. I think one of the problems here is that Brexit is impossible to deliver, and that both Conservatives and Labour are more concerned with staying in power than they are with necessarily what's doing the best for the country or the economy. I mean, the same is true of the Republicans when they support Donald Trump and his thing. They're more concerned with their own positions than what's good for the country. I think it's a terribly sad state of affairs. The only thing that kind of...
Just going to hurry you up because the phone line's getting on my nerves. It's not your fault.
The only thing that I was thinking is that really, they have to give it to Boris Johnson, because if they give it to Jeremy Hunt, they will just say it's another Remainer that somebody else could have done it better.
I mean, except that Jeremy Hunt is telling the truth, and the person whose shadow should be cast over all of this, of course, is Jacob Rees-Mogg's favourite economist, Patrick Minford, who's on the record explaining precisely why a so-called no-deal Brexit would see the decimation of, and you are allowed to use that word in a different context from precisely what it meant in the context of Roman legions, the decimation of manufacturing and agriculture. So this is the weird bit. After 3 and a bit years, it's all come true. Not what Project Fear said, but what Patrick Minford, the economist of the European Research Group, has always said. And yet Jacob Rees-Mogg, who talks undiluted nonsense about Article 24 of GATT being something that we can revert to without mentioning it's entirely up to the European Union whether we can even do that, and it would involve a trade deal already being in place. How do you know that, James? Because the Director General of the World Trade Organization said so yesterday, and they still applaud Johnson. We used to play this game. Nick taught me this. I don't know if I should tell you this. Ferrari taught me this. When I used to do daytime TV with audiences, I had great fun doing it. I'm going to sound a bit snobbish now. I don't do it anymore, but I was very glad of the opportunity to do that kind of TV back then, quite a long time ago. I used to love doing the debates on the Alan Titchmarsh show. I'd be debating anything from dog poo. Horribly insulted by Martin Clunes once when I was having a debate about dogs. I can't remember, or charity chuggers or something like that. Called me a word I can't repeat on the radio, and he got away with it on daytime television. I think the clip's on YouTube somewhere if you want to give yourself a giggle. But the point was this: Nick taught me that you don't actually. It doesn't matter what you say. You see it on Question Time sometimes. Is if you deliver your words in a certain way, and I think it happened to Michael Gove recently, where he got to the end of the. I'm going to call it a crescendo, a verbal crescendo, or a rhetorical crescendo. And it was clearly designed to pause for applause or to invite applause, and it didn't come. So what you do in front of an audience like that, even if, like me, you were punting essentially sort of anti-right-wing ideas, and the audience was usually quite old and set in its ways, and so lent a little bit towards soft right-wing positions. If you did the words right, it didn't matter what the words actually were. So you'd find yourself sort of going, let me get this right. I'll give you a quick setup for the next topic that we're going to talk about on the programme, and I'll show you what I mean. Patients are being encouraged to ask Amazon's Alexa for health advice instead of seeing a doctor. And then you pause, and it doesn't matter what you've actually said. In a bid to relieve pressure on the NHS, Health Secretary Matt Hancock urged Britons to use the tech firm smart speakers for help with common illnesses. Pause. Applaud. Do you see? And that's Johnson in a nutshell. The people in the audience last night, from what I saw, couldn't have told you what he just said. They'd have just told, why did you clap? Oh, because Boris wanted us to. Doff cap, tug forelock, vote Johnson. It's 10:44. Chris is in Tower Hamlets. Chris, what would you like to say?
James, I think you're absolutely right. There's no magic solution to the appeal. It's going
to get worse before it gets better, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, the one quote of Winston Churchill's that hardly anybody ever repeats is when he said the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average British voter.
I don't know if we're ready to go down that road yet, but I take your point.
No, right. but here's one, possible thought about this. I wrote to the editors of all the BBC's flagship programmes, Watto and PM and so on, to say, look, if you do get a chance to interview Boris Johnson, or any of the supporters of no deal, people in positions of power and authority who say, well, if it is no deal, we'll survive, we'll cope.
Yes.
You could say to them, legitimately then, do you mean the British people as a whole will survive, will cope, including the people on 0 hours contracts and so on, or do you mean people like you? And it's a legitimate question. You could actually ask Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg, have you got private health care? Have you paid off your mortgage?
Have you?
Will your children go to private schools?
Has the company you founded moved 2 investment funds to Dublin?
Yeah. In other words,
I think you're over. I think you're slightly overcomplicating it. You give them forgive me, but for me, the trick that's missed is simply to read their own words back to them. That's all you need to do now. And I don't understand why everybody... Well, I do understand why a lot of people aren't doing it. It's because they fell for the con as well. But everybody who didn't, why not just read their own words straight back to them? Mr. Johnson, we have learnt today that BMW is moving engine production to Germany. You said that BMW would ...
Yeah.
And if we did that, then you don't actually let them move on until they've either acknowledged that they were wrong before, at which point you say, so what exactly qualifies you to claim that you're right now? Or you call the interview. It reaches the end with them refusing to explain how they could have got things so wrong. And still, this is what I call the Ian Duncan Smith syndrome, Chris. To have been so utterly wrong about everything. To have presided over a catastrophic leadership of your own party. To have brought in benefits changes that have caused death. To have been busted for having a fake CV, and still to stand up. It's almost enviable, isn't it, that level of self-delusion, to still stand up in public and say, well, I think you should all listen to me. I'm absolutely the part, and let me tell you, I am supremely qualified to talk about X, Y, and Z, when I don't think the man has ever been right about anything.
No, I quite agree with you. I don't disagree with a single thing you've said. I was making a just ever so slightly different point.
No, I get it. I like it.
I think
points out they will be fine. They will all be fine, and that's why they're co-opting the working class. I wondered when this was going to happen. Daily Mail have got a Labour MP to write an article, or a former Labour MP to write an article, abandoning the working class by adopting this Remain position. Explain that. Explain how the job losses described by Patrick Mimford, the economist of choice for the Economic Research Group, ludicrously misnomered, almost as ridiculous a title as Taxpayers Alliance, and they're rather friendly with each other, of course. Explain exactly how the collapse in farming and manufacturing that they describe is going to be of benefit to the working class and somehow be bad news for the so-called elites. That would be the other question I'd ask if they ever came anywhere near me. Jeremy Hunt, dismal and honest. You're going to lose your job, but you voted for it, and I will deliver those job losses with a heavy heart. Boris Johnson, splendidly dishonest. So splendidly dishonest that people can forgive the abomination of his dishonesty and instead focus upon the splendour, the scale. You're not going to lose your job. Everything's going to be brilliant. Every single thing I've said about Brexit has turned out not to be true, but I swear to you the next thing I say will be absolutely 100% kosher. That's Johnson. Which one are they going to vote for? The one still promising unicorns. Which one's probably going to end up... Well, he's already Foreign Secretary. The one that presided over an astonishing diminishment of our National Health Service. And speaking of our National Health Service, the latest Secretary of State for Health is suggesting that you consult Alexa about your illnesses, symptoms, and I'm going to have to find a way to discuss that before 1 o'clock today that doesn't set off your electronic devices every single time, because a lot of you are listening to me through one of those devices, and if I say that word, it really, I'll tell you what it reminds me of. You know when you get into a lift and there's two mirrors in it and it actually goes on forever? You see the reflection of your reflection, and then you look again and you see the reflection of your reflection's reflection, and then you look again and you see the reflection of your reflection's reflection. That's a bit how I feel when I say that word on the radio, and then the thing... I digress. Let's get back to the madness of British politics. Donal is in Hackney. Donal, what have you got?
Hello there, James.
Hello.
My very simple reply to your very simple question about how do we get here is, I think it's a question of what it is to be English. I am an Irishman who lives in this country, but I feel like I have got that split personality problem. There's the first bit of me as an Irishman who's incredibly grateful and happy and proud to have been afforded the honour to come and live in this wonderful country.
Yes.
But then there's the Irishman who thinks about the 800 years of oppression and rapage and pillage that went on in my country, and terrible things that happened in my family and terrible things that happened in many other people's family in Ireland. And that bit of me makes me lie down on the floor and roll around as an Irishman thinking this wonderful act of self-harm that the English are carrying on to themselves is a hilarious thing. And then I stop and my third personality kicks in.
Good grief.
And that's
it's like a Stephen
the
King
Irishman
novel.
who lives in this country, who's found love in this country, is fathering 4 children in this country, is happy to pay taxes in this country, happy to work in this country, get all the benefits that come from this country. And it's madness.
Well, it is. Although I have to say the old country is going to be, I suspect, looking more attractive on all of the fronts you've just described than your current place of residence. Not too far from now. But
well, except for the fact, James, that I don't. It seems to me that there seems to be a great lack of understanding from many of your esteemed leaders in this country as to the terrible effects, not least in relation to the backstop, but the terrible effects that if we all went back 10 years to another time.
Tell me about it.
And there seems to be no understanding at the risks involved in returning to that time. Worse than that, there doesn't seem to be any worry. It's as if it couldn't happen. And that's frightening for many Irish people.
I know it is.
And it's frightening for many British people because terrible things happened in this country.
And you don't want to overcomplicate things, but terrorism and criminality go hand in hand. Two different tariff systems on either side of the border create perfectly fertile ground for smuggling. Smuggling is one of the favourite...
Open door for criminality.
Thank you. The criminality comes in, gets a boost. What do they spend their ill-gotten gains on? Historically, weapons and Semtex. This is a very, very, very simplistic analysis, but a lot of people, I think, benefit from just looking through the keyhole of these issues. I've got one problem with your analysis, Donal.
Tell me.
The word English is far too generalised because you're harking back.
James, because
no, I know why you use it, and this is helpful for me to focus my mind because you're referring back to a kind of colonial heritage, right? When you
not quite, James. I use English simply because I think. Because I think Scottish people define themselves differently.
No, you misunderstand me. You misunderstand me. So you mean a nostalgia for Britannia ruling the waves? That's the kind of mindset that you're talking about.
It's the mindset which...
No, I'm not disputing the mindset.
No, I know. I understand.
But the massive mystery,
the
mystery of politics for me is the utter failure of, 99% maximum, but even if it was 52% of the population, they will be serfs in a return to 19th century style English exceptionalism. They will have the 21st century equivalent of workhouses and watching their children sent up chimneys. And you know what Jacob Rees-Mogg will say? If we do return to that level of inequality and injustice, he'll say that he finds workhouses very uplifting, just like he finds food banks uplifting. Jacob Rees-Mogg, I realised yesterday, he is a Charles Dickens cosplay character. He literally could have been written by Dickens. So I used to use the word English in the context that you're using it today. But I think of myself as mostly English, most days. And I don't recognise what you describe. It's this really weird idea that we're going to go back to the days of Downton Abbey and everybody's going to be a lord.
I don't disagree with you, James. I'd qualify it in two ways. I'd qualify it in two ways. One, in relation to simply that I don't see within themselves the same problems within Scottish and Welsh people, which is why I use the word English. And also, James, you're a much kinder man than me. You endow your audience with intelligence on a daily basis.
Of course, I have to.
You're kind, and we hear the evidence of it most days. And yet, James, what you've just said is self-evident. How come so many working class, poverty-stricken people in this country pine for those what you've just described and vote for it, James?
I know.
How do you explain that to me? I know you're doing the interview, but anyway.
I think it is... Well, at the simplest psychological level, I vote for inequality in the belief that I'll be on the right side of the inequality. And the second, historically, and this is something that's very much a work in progress for me intellectually, but it ties in with that thing I said earlier about a certain type of successful white middle-aged man having a real problem with women of colour, in particular in power, whether they've married into the royal family or whether their husbands are president of America or whether they're senators or whether they're tennis players or whatever it might be, and having a problem with men of colour as well. I think if you're white working class, you've been sold nostalgia for the days when you didn't have to share what little you had with the women and the gays and the Muslims and the immigrants and the Poles and the Romanians and the Irish and the people, because I'd seen a tiny little uptick in anti-Irish racism coming into the studio recently. And so that's the Englishness you describe. We might have had very, very little, but at least we didn't have to share it with the blacks. I think that's the mindset you're describing.
Yeah.
And that's why I get calls from people saying, I voted to leave the European Union because there's so many brown faces behind the tills in Tesco.
I think you've just stated, as usual, better than I ever could, James. I think what it strikes to the heart of is defining who you are, what you are, what oneself is. And I think that that's a conversation that this if this country could stop the world, everybody step off for a few hours or a few weeks or a few months or whatever it took, had the talk and decided, right, this is what it means to be British, this is what it means to be English, this is what it means to be a person in this country, it'd be a wonderful thing. But
and I'll tell you what it wouldn't involve. It wouldn't involve letting an American president bully our Prime Minister and throw our ambassador under a bus. That's the very definition of treachery. And it's a massively overused word. And yet with everything else in this sort of weird alt-right universe, it's a word that's used by people who are actually guilty of it. I hear people talk about traitors and treachery when they're describing High Court judges, MPs and journalists. And then you actually have a leak damaging to our own government, pandering to a foreign power that is in many ways hostile to our own government. And then people who use words like traitor and treachery, like they're going out of fashion, are defending, cheering and siding with the foreign government and attacking the British diplomat. And I can't bear repetition enough. That's how mad everything has become. There's quite an interesting addition to the conversation that we're having that's just dropped. A suggestion of a way in which Boris Johnson might be able to persuade the ERG, because it was they, of course, who blocked Brexit, despite history not in the context of most media recording it that way, to back it. So I'm going to try and explain it to you, and then we'll get back into the question, which one rather brilliant contributor, Dan Howdell, has just described like having to choose which chuckle brother you want to paint your house. That's the current prime ministerial dilemma that the country, or at least 160-odd thousand Conservative Party members, face. So if you extend the transition arrangement, the transition agreement, indefinitely, so you don't put a time limit on the transition agreement, you get rid of the problem of the backstop. So I think I've understood this correctly. Theresa May kind of toyed with it. Scottish MPs, Tory MPs, didn't like it because it would mean the common fisheries policy remained in place. The UP probably wouldn't go mad for it either. But as Laura Kunzberg points out, the BBC's political editor, it ignores what Boris Johnson is effective at, which is selling stuff to punters. So the idea of... I buy this, actually. I think it would almost fall into the category of no deal and no Brexit, or Brino, as it was called, briefly. But Boris Johnson, I think, hand on heart, do you think Boris Johnson could sell something to right-wingers that Theresa May couldn't sell to right-wingers? You know how desperately I search every morning for things upon which we can all agree, regardless of what you think of them, even if you find, as I do, Boris Johnson ridiculously dishonest and Theresa May absurdly incompetent. That kind of plays into the idea that he's a better salesman than her. He's knocking at the door of Downing Street, despite having been the worst foreign secretary in living memory and wasted hundreds of millions of pounds as mayor of London and broken promises galore to voters, not just to wives. But he is good at selling himself, chiefly. But if he becomes synonymous with, I don't know, I would dig into it a little bit more. So they'll still be in government. Boris Johnson will be able to say, I know the EU at the moment have kind of already knocked this into the long grass or poo-pooed it, but he could, it kind of extend the transition period indefinitely, which would let him claim that he'd succeeded in reopening the withdrawal agreement. Right? He could say, they said it couldn't be done. This is a rather good Twitter account. I don't think I've come across it before. It's a Financial Times writer says, called Martin Sandbu, getting an indefinite transition period into the withdrawal agreement would allow Johnson to claim two things truthfully. He would have succeeded in reopening the withdrawal agreement, and then he speculates on how Johnson would sell that. They said it couldn't be done, my friends, but I did it. And the backstop would be killed dead. Because if you're not allowed to stop the transition period until the problem with the border has been solved, I think it's just the backstop under another name, but with a good salesman. As things stand, with the fear of no deal on the horizon, I would personally, as an arch Remainer, I would take that as it stands. Whether or not the EU would take it, I do not know. But anyway, back to the business in hand, rather than the doodlings in the margins. How have we ended up essentially entrusting the Conservative Party membership with deciding which chuckle brother paints our house. 0345 6060 973. Neil's in Melbourne, Australia. I don't know why I said Australia. Oh, there is. I think there's a Melbourne in Lincolnshire, actually. So there we go. Melbourne, Australia. What would you like to say, Neil?
Good morning. I'm originally from the UK,
Yes.
but I picked up the telephone, James, initially because when you said that you thought you'd been on Mars and you painted the picture earlier.
If I had been,
I actually left the UK. Yes. I actually left the UK on the 27th of June 2016, and I worked in India, and I've been living in Singapore and travelling around Asia since. And
By coincidence,
I feel as though
you didn't plan to leave the day after the referendum. That was just in the diary already, I presume.
That was just the way that work was.
Amazing timing! I love that. So you're a bit like that. You're a bit like at the beginning of a Richard Curtis film, aren't you? You actually left on the day that everything began to change.
Absolutely. I mean, well, yes, and I left Hong Kong in 1997.
Good grief. Promise me you'll never move to Kidderminster.
The morning of the Asian financial crisis.
Good grief.
I was on an aeroplane and I landed back in the UK. My mother said, "What's happened about the crash?" And I went, "My God, has there been an aeroplane crash?" She went, "No, financial crash."
What have you done now, Neil? She said, "What have you done now, son?" Honestly.
I know.
It's gone. So what do you see when you look in the rear view?
Tell you anyway.
No, of course.
Well, so I'm in the investment business, and I deal, and I'm originally from Hartlepool in the northeast of England, which is a big Labour seat. That's recently changed. But I'm now dealing with these very large pension funds, sovereign wealth funds around Asia and Australia and the Middle East. And I feel as though I'm actually representing the UK.
Yes.
From a people's perspective, because people are saying to me when they hear headlines about what's happening last night, all of the nonsense that's been in the months and months and months before. Neil, what's happening? Tell me.
Yeah.
What a mess. Why are you in this? Why am I in this position? Why is the UK in this position? And you look at this memo, this email, this fax, whatever it was, the telegram that the US the UK ambassador has sent back to the UK.
In confidence.
How many people in similar positions are sending emails telling their governments that the UK is inept and it's a load of rubbish and a complete liars? I bet every other country's doing that. And I'm embarrassed. I love the UK with a passion. With an absolute passion, and I hope to return in the next 2 years if the contract goes well. I really, really do. And
well, if you're an investor, there'll be rich pickings for you, Neil. Although you might want to register an office in Dublin so you can take full advantage of both sides.
Yeah, but you know what, James? I actually like the UK overall. Economically, I think the UK's got fantastic opportunity. I like India and I like Japan, and I don't like much else. And I think the UK people are so resilient and they're pulled together and they will get through this.
Yeah, but I'm not having that. I'm sorry. I know we're getting on famously, but no one said vote for this and we'll have to be resilient, pull together and get through it. They said vote for this and you'll be richer, happier and more secure.
I agree.
So you can't. I'm not going to let that pass. I'm not going to fall out with you, but I'm not going to let them look back and say, oh, well, we survived 2 world wars. No one said we're voting for something that we're going to compare to the biggest wars in history, did they? They said we're voting for sunlit uplands, having your cake and eating it. Sorry,
absolutely.
Rant over.
No. I'm with you because I feel cheated, and because I feel as though I've been working for the UK government and basically trying to put together a nice picture and making excuses.
I think we all feel a bit like that. Everyone in business and media who travels a bit. You get asked to speak as a sort of de facto ambassador. What the hell is going on in your country?
Absolutely.
I get it a lot. I was in Ireland most recently, and every question.
And people say to me, the politicians think we're going to get a trade deal? Really? You really think people want to deal with us when we can't tell the truth in Parliament?
Well, that'll be the next stage.
People are lying.
The next stage will be...
Absolutely, it will be. And that'll be very telling.
It'll be we have to take whatever dismal terms Donald Trump and his cronies offer because we've been so weakened by Brexit, and how the people that told us Brexit was going to make us stronger are going to segue effortlessly into telling us that we have to sign up with Donald Trump's vastly inferior, dismal trade organisation is something that, as a student of these matters, I'm quite looking forward to seeing the new contortion that they have to undertake. But like you, I dread and I despise the damage it's doing, utterly unnecessarily, to our country. Oh, happy days. You mentioned Singapore.
Yes.
I want to ask you a question.
Singapore is so efficient.
Yes, sure. There are arguments for not so big on protections and regulations, but then not wanting to generalise, these aren't always top of the list of priorities for investors. Do you know who's just paid $79 million for the most expensive apartment in Singapore, Neil?
I don't actually know because I've been travelling, so I'm not...
It's all right, nobody else knows either. That's why they tune into this programme. I'll say it again for anyone who's not paying attention, because we mentioned earlier in the programme we hadn't heard much from Digby Jones for a while. He was one of the people talking up the business benefits of Brexit back in the day, and it occurred to me there was someone else we hadn't heard from much lately, and he has just paid $79 million for the most expensive apartment in Singapore. Does that help you have a guess at what his name might be?
Well, it could be...
I don't want to hoover up all the clues.
I know, but...
I don't want to give you the hairdryer treatment. I don't want to give you the hairdryer treatment.
I know. Mr. D, right? Mr. D, so...
Mr. James Dyson has just paid $79 million for the most expensive apartment in Singapore after telling the plebs back in Britain to vote for Brexit because it would make their country better.
I think I understand why he's done it.
Well, I do as well. He doesn't want to live here.
He employs...
and he's moved his manufacturing there. But I'm not generalising about investors. 11:15 is the time. What else do we need today? I kind of carry on with this for a while, but there are businesses that are going to come here as a result of a no-deal Brexit. 0345 6060 973. We could do 10 minutes on that. Will that be enough? I mean, there must be loads. Sort of people who text and tweet me abuse every day will have companies coming out of their back pockets that are coming here precisely because of no-deal Brexit. I'll say it again, because these things obviously need to be repeated at least a gazillion times before people understand them. A company revealing that it's going to carry on doing business here on a reduced or identical scale to what it was doing before is not proof of Brexit being a good idea. It's good news in the context of a fire extinguisher being good news. While the rest of the building burns, you can at least put out the fire in this room. So who's coming here? Who's coming here to open up a business in Brexit Britain? 0345 6060 973. It's 11:16. I want to talk about this Amazon smart speaker being touted by Matt Hancock as an alternative to going to your GP. And I want to try and do it straight, because I do catch myself sometimes falling into traps that I describe other people as living in. You don't have to get angry about new suggestions. You don't have to get spooked by change. As you get older, it gets ever harder, doesn't it, to not get a little bit spooked. Oh, things were better in my day. I presume that doctors and nurses aren't going to go mad about this, but I also think, looking at the story, that it's not entirely without merit. I don't know whether it plays into our fears about Conservative politicians trying to move healthcare increasingly from public sector provision to private sector. I don't know. I don't know whether that money is involved in this idea or whether or not simply using the Amazon smart speaker. I'm not saying the name so that it doesn't go all weird if you're listening to me through an Amazon smart speaker, all right? See? I never stop thinking about you. Always at the top of my list of priorities. It's all about you, you know. Barely ever refer to myself on this programme. So anyway, as I was saying, the Amazon smart speaker, or smart speaker, could actually be able to provide you with satisfactory answers to some questions regarding your health. But as with yesterday's conversation about this astonishing state of affairs with consultant senior doctors' pensions, I would like to hear from doctors and nurses. They've been updated, the devices, to include NHS advice. I think, in the spirit of bursting balloons of belligerence, which is something of a hobby of ours on this programme, I presume that this is just the equivalent of Googling stuff, except you do it with your voice rather than your fingers, right? Because you might often Google something like, what are the symptoms of flu? And then you'd take the answers and you'd think, oh, my Lord. If you're anything like me, you'd think, oh, my God, I think I've got smallpox. But sensible people will Google symptoms and get a reply and then decide whether or not they're going to go to the doctor. Self-diagnosis on the internet is not great. It's, a lot of my doctor friends tell me it can actually be a nightmare. You get people turning up with lipstick on their collar claiming they've got rubella. But we all do it, and so we'll find out. I quite like this story, or I like bits of it. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. We are trying to decide which Chuckle Brother, and I know that one of the actors who played the Chuckle Brother passed away recently, but I think he'd enjoy us having some fun with the analogy between the famously incompetent handymen, somehow us being offered a choice between two Chuckle Brothers when deciding who's going to be the next Prime Minister, except that's a little unfair on the Chuckle Brothers, because Jeremy Hunt is dismal but honest. You will lose your job. You voted for it. I will make sure it happens with a heavy heart. Boris Johnson is dismal and dishonest. You won't lose your job. You will have your cake and eat it. The sunlit uplands are just around the corner. If you only just have some optimism, everything will be splendid. And that's an astonishing choice. But that's all we've got. And I want to know how you think we got here. How did this happen? Alan's in Bankery in Aberdeenshire. Alan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Well, with regards to the who got us, how did we get here? I think we've got to look behind the scenes. All at the Tories, at Labour, within the PR merchants that are, selling snakeskin oil, basically.
But I have to preface what you're about to say by saying I do this for a living. And I last night, as I took a step back from the daily analysis, I just found myself going, how the hell did this happen?
Yeah, I do that on a daily basis. I mean,
Go on then. What have you got?
Daughters. I'm Scottish. I've got an English wife, 2 beautiful daughters. And my worry is, apart from the whole Brexit shambles, that if and when the UK does leave the EU, that little Jimmy cranky character that's a
bit unfair, but I know who you're referring to.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't want to name her in case she sets off as well, like the Amazon device. She'll rear her ugly head and...
Oh, no, mate, we don't need to do it. Well, I suppose I was a little bit rude about Anne Widdecombe earlier in the week. You're being rude about Nicola Sturgeon, but I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with men criticising how women look.
She'll rear her head and she'll try and instigate Scottish independence again.
Yes.
Sadly, I really do think if she does, I genuinely feel they're going to win it this time.
Yes.
As a Scotsman, I voted to stay in the UK.
Did you also vote to stay in the European Union?
Yes, I did.
Yes, we did a phone-in on this. It's a shame you missed it. You might be able to download it because you're right. I think a lot of people who, like you, voted for both are now feeling as if they're going to be asked to prioritise one over the other.
It really is. It's such a shame because I think that this has been not only conspired. I think this is down to the PR gurus and the puppet masters behind the Conservative Party. Because they've actually created this mess altogether. Rees-Mogg, Farage, etc.
Well, he's not actually in the Conservative Party, remember?
No, but there is the rumour that he will get back into the cabinet if Boris gets to be PM. I've heard that.
I hope so. I hope so. Make the Christmas parties a lot more palatable here at LBC Towers. But what would you... Well, I don't know. I mean, what I'm looking at the moment is the links between the quotes journalist, end quotes, who leaked the confidential diplomatic information at the weekend and her previous associations with Lord Ashcroft, who paid her to write that hostile biography of David Cameron. That's why I slightly object to the notion of these people being proper conservatives. And then she also ghostwrote that book, The Bad Boys of Brexit. Goodness me, you'd have thought that was something out of the Beano. And the links there that have emerged, they're really, really interesting. And they're not about the Conservative establishment. I think Rees-Mogg is just a Charles Dickens villain tribute act.
He really is.
He doesn't have the depth to have planned any of this or to have undertaken it. He just genuinely believes that the plebs should know their place. And his great success, of course, is having all the plebs queuing up to say, I know my place, Mr. Jacobs, sir. I know my place, Mr. Jacobs, sir. You can hear him ringing in to LBC when he does the thing with Nick every other Monday. They ring, oh, Mr. Jacobs, sir, doff cap, tug forelock, so I know my place. And he is literally going to be, well, not literally, but if his favourite economist is right, these are the people that are voting for their own unemployment.
Yeah, and he's fitting in. I read something last month about how it seems UK politics has created or engendered the characters of old.
Oh, it's 19th century.
Yeah. So, I mean...
With the abiding mystery of why people who think they were the good old days don't realise that it was their ancestors in the workhouses and their ancestors being sent up chimneys at the age of 7.
Yeah, I know. And it scares me.
What do you want? Low regulation economy. Well, what does low regulation mean? Well, it means that you don't work in factories where you might get your arm chopped off by lunchtime anymore.
That's okay. Because if you get your arm chopped off, you'd have to pay a fortune to go to the...
No, you wouldn't. You could just ask your Amazon electronic device what to do.
Yeah, you could do. And it'll say, yes, you have to pay X amount per year for health insurance to the new privatised NHS.
And then looking at the spider's web of associations and links that someone has put together this morning, you have to ask yourself, that Aaron Banks character, how did he make his money?
Yeah.
Health insurance.
Nothing to do with Russia.
No, I'm not. You don't even need to bring that into it. It's just health insurance. Oh, man alive. It's like join the dots and people can't see what's in front of them. What will you do, though? I'm genuinely interested to know what you will do if you do ultimately...
What will I do? Well, that's the thing. I will probably... we've got a nice garden. I'll get my brother's digger and dig a hole and live in it.
But I meant more to do with the question of leaving this union in order to stay in that union. I mean, it's a long way off, and it's by no means a foregone conclusion. But I do think you're right that Nicola Sturgeon, or Jimmy Cranky, as you prefer to describe her, I do think she will, if there is a no-deal Brexit or a Brexit that is anything like actually leaving rather than staying in but pretending we've left, which is, I think, now the best-case scenario for most of us, or many of us. What would you prefer? Hand on heart, 10, 15 years down the line, would you rather remain in a United Kingdom that's not in the European Union or remain in an independent Scotland that is in the European Union?
Yeah, I would probably say, to be honest, the European Union.
Yeah. I haven't had anybody say the other. And you are quite a passionate unionist.
I was.
Well, that's why you rang in, though, isn't it?
Yeah, I am a passionate unionist, as in I'm Scottish. I voted to stay in the union.
But you rang in to spook us with the prospect of Scottish independence, even though if push came to shove, you'd take that over what's currently on the horizon.
I really would. Because,
I get it.
Scottish politics, at the moment, they're the lesser evil. They really are. And that scares me, because in Scottish politics, you look at the facts. Scotland has the biggest debt for the likes of methadone. It's subsidised heavily by the UK government by that.
It changes from year to year overall, whether it's a net taker or a net giver. But I think Scotland would, retaining all of its trade agreements, is it 759 or something like that? Not all trade, of course. They also cover things like medicine and aviation and all that sort of malarkey. But the Scotland would probably do better jumping the way you described than it would jumping the way I described. And yet you have to register, of course, that it will make people unhappy. Even people that will vote to be independent of the United Kingdom would rather not. They want to be in both unions. But we've robbed them of that choice. It's something I had to explain to James Cleverly this morning. Bless him. There's this ludicrous picture that the Conservatives have all been ordered to reveal, saying delays don't... What is it? Let me get this right for you. Delays don't make deals, deadlines do. James Cleverly has retweeted that, saying, I used to work in print media advertising. Believe me, this is true. And again, for the gazillionth time, you have to point out to people like James Cleverly that if he had failed to do a deal when he was in print media advertising, nothing would have changed. His print media advertising business would have carried on exactly as it was before negotiations for this new deal opened, right? A no-deal Brexit, which Boris Johnson is promising to deliver, would involve torching the company that he currently works for and replacing 759 deals with optimism. The EU, meanwhile, loses one member. Has the penny dropped yet?